I have to stand up and preach. I was just sitting. Thank you. What a beautiful song. Well, this morning we continue our series called The Art of Neighboring. This challenge that Jesus laid out to love your neighbor. This challenge that in many ways is the simplest thing to grasp on paper. Or maybe the simplest thing to grasp on a Sunday morning when we go, oh yeah, love neighbor, we got this, right? And yet, in reality, it's very difficult to live out. It's one of those straightforward commands that we often complicate, that we often ignore, that we often make into a metaphor or some ideal goal. Someday we'll love our neighbor, right? But we often just don't follow it. Last week we looked at the foundation of this series, that commandment of Jesus to love God and love neighbor. That everything else can be summed up in that commandment. And we asked that question, that what if Jesus really meant what he said when he said love your neighbor? And we realized that sometimes we don't love neighbor because what we've done is we've skirted the issue. We've done the loophole thing by saying, well, I love all my neighbors. You're just not my neighbor. We've narrowed the definition of neighbor. And so if we have a true biblical Jesus definition of neighbor, it includes everyone. And love, we concluded also, must not just be lip service, but it must be tangible. So this week we're going to start kind of digging into different groups of people that we might struggle loving as our neighbor. And this first group of people is a group that we talk about a lot in church. I've gone to countless training things, seminars, workshops, pastoral gatherings, meetings, all about this idea of, boy, what if we could just get the kids back to church? If we could just get young people in the church. If we could just reach the next generation, right? So we talk about it, we wish we could do it, we hope we could do it, but when the rubber meets the road, we often are not willing to do the hard work of reaching the next generation. Or we're willing to fund a program. Churches have been good for the last 60 years at funding programs for kids, as long as they stay down and over there, or up there. Well, just don't be too loud up there, right? I know Pat probably had a lot of youth up there back in the day, and he probably got a lot of comments about those loud children up there. Am I right? Yeah, I wasn't here, but I had those same comments. When I was a youth pastor for 17 odd years. I worked with children, or youth, not children, but youth in the church, teenagers, junior high, and high schoolers. And one of the things, and I worked in large churches, 1,500 member church, 1,600 members, to little bitty churches with like 20 members. And one thing that was a common factor was that a large percentage of the students, when they graduated high school, would leave church. Not all, but a good half of them would leave church. And I always have asked myself, why is that? And as I started to think about this, I realized that in churches we tend to create wonderful spaces for children and youth in churches. Great Sunday school rooms, great youth ministry programs, all as long as they're not loud or messy, but all of these wonderful things. This is a side story. When I was a youth pastor in Clovis, every Sunday I'd get to church and I'd get talked to about the kitchen at church was left messy because of the youth group. And I would think, we weren't even in the kitchen. How is it so messy? And so kids, you can't go in the kitchen. And this went on for weeks and weeks. And then I realized, you know who was leaving it messy? The choir. The choir. The music, right? I just, oh my gosh. But who was to be blamed? The youth. The darn teenagers. See, so we create these programs, we create these things, and they're amazing. And some churches really go all out. They build entire youth buildings. You know, my budget at the church in Florida, my youth ministry budget was almost $40,000 a year to run the youth ministry program, plus 2 full-time staff people. You might say, they care about youth, right? And what tends to happen is that as they graduate high school, they age out of that program, and then they have to come where? To what we call big church. We just called, I don't know why we called it big church. Maybe that was a Florida thing, but we called it big church. Okay, kids, and they would sort of hang on, right? Well, can't I just help with the youth? No, it's kind of, you're 19, they're 17, it's not appropriate, there was some age things and rules. No, you need to just go to church. It's great, church. And a majority of these teenagers would end up leaving the church, or they would find a church, or, which has happened with a lot of large churches, is they would just go start their own church. Generally a non-denominational church of some sort. And that would break my heart, as I know it has for many of you, as you wonder, where are my children? And where are my grandchildren, right? I want to read some things. I read a couple of these to our church council a few months back. But these are, I put out on Facebook a question, why don't you go to church? Targeting people under the age of 50. I'm going to read you some of these. And these are these are just quotes, okay? And if we're going to begin loving the next generation, we have to begin listening to the next generation, right? So, first one said this, bottom line, age gap anxiety. Being the youngest in the church by 40 years is shocking. Another one, millennials by and large find most religion to be unbelievable in the face of scientific discovery. I actually agree on a philosophical level. I think there's a strong case to be made for the existence of God. The problem is the church hasn't been proactive enough in presenting that case. Another one, I think a need for such institutions diminishes the more affluent and technologically advanced a society becomes. Another one, in my experience, I believe one can be spiritual without going to a building once or multiple times a week. I've met way too many people who love to brag about being Christians and going to church every Sunday, and they were some of the worst people I've ever dealt with during the week. No integrity, no concern for others, so egocentric, they thought the universe revolved around them. Just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. I was raised in a Catholic home and attended Catholic school, so it was kind of shoved down my throat. If I chose to worship, I will worship on my own in private. You were a good man, Tom, but I feel you're an exception, not the rule. That was nice. As I'm reading this, feeling awful. Another one. People sing about drawing circles wide and say, I can come as I am. However, I have to put on my church attitude and use my church words and put on my church smile for people who don't even see me. I want church to be the place I can be broken. Instead, it broke me. And I constantly need to go away for a while to patch my heart up. Another one, frankly, I grew tired of my ideas being dismissed, my efforts being dismissed, and the overall rudeness of membership towards anything I did. Until the church literally practices what it preaches, what Jesus preached, I can't go back. That is welding love and acceptance to all us sinners, us gays, drunks, porn addicted, without judgment. And the people making the church decision should be in their 40s, not 70s. I'd say it should be all of us. And last one, and then we'll move on. This is a friend of mine who's the son of a minister. Grown-up son of a minister. He's in his 40s. The church services are really designed for my parents and their generation, and they hold no appeal to me. It's not just a been there, done that. It's an uncomfortableness, like a bad family holiday gathering at the aunt's house that still looks like 1965, and the kids hate going because they can't touch or do anything or make a sound, full of strange relatives who ask the very personal questions and make snide remarks. It's awkward and stuffy, and the best feeling is the relief of leaving. My parents are perfectly at home there, of course. Those are their friends, their routine, their activities, their music, their coffee, printouts, casserole classes, etc. I don't feel the need for those traditions in my life. They belong to them just as much as my dad's Joan Collins records. It's hard to get past the Sunday morning time machine. I end up going about once a year and feeling the same way each time. Now, this is just one quick segment, and I don't share that to discourage you or to make you feel defensive, and if you're feeling a little defensive, it's okay. Set that aside. Set that aside. And I know there's just as many young people out there that come to church and love church, whether it's church like how our worship is or big rock and rolling church, they love it all. The issue, I think, begins when we as adults begin to change our perspective on teens, kids, and young adults, and it just begins with loving them. Oftentimes, we just don't really love them the way Jesus called us to love them. If we were to look at a narrow version of neighbor definition, we might exclude them at times. Often we spend more time complaining about the next generation than we do loving them. Let me ask you, this week, did you have a conversation where you said something about younger generation? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the last year you had that conversation? Included the statement, those millennials, those young people, right? It happens. And it breaks my heart because my daughter's a millennial. And I'm like, she's not that. All those stereotypes. So let me look through these scriptures real quick. Matthew 18, it says that at the time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Of course, we know the disciples were always jockeying for position because they thought that somehow Jesus was going to usher in a real kingdom, right? A real earthly kingdom. And so they're trying to make sure they get a good spot in it once Jesus throws out the Romans. They're always worried about that. And so they're so worried about that, even though they just didn't get it. Jesus kept talking about, the cross and selflessness and first and last and all this. And so to make it a point, Jesus turns and he calls a child to him. There probably were kids running around all the time out where Jesus was preaching. And so instead of, giving him another parable, he goes, well, I'm just going to show you a parable. And he goes, bring that little child over here. And I love that scene. Bring me this little child. You see, children were not considered important. One commentator said this, a child was a person of no importance in Jewish society. They were subject to the authority of their elders, not taken seriously. They were one to be looked after, not one to be looked up to. He called the child and placed them among them. I think as followers of Jesus, we are to follow Jesus' example, to call the children among us. To say, come and be part of who we are. Not to be those children, but to be children among us. And so what does that look like, right? To call children and to place them among us. Jesus goes on, he says, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like this little child. What? Okay, you're playing with my voice. Unless you change and become like a child, you will never enter the kingdom. Woo! You awake? Kids love that. So whoever takes and acts like a child, be like children. He says, welcome the children and act like children. Isn't that great? The older we get, sometimes we get a little like kids. Can't be acting like a child. You're acting foolish like a child. How do kids act? They're kind. They're innocent. They're real. Sometimes we don't like the realness of kids, do we? I hate the realness of kids sometimes. It's always the 4-year-old that goes, you're fat, right? Right? And you're like, well, you're smart mouth. See, it's always the little kid. But they're real, they're honest. They're reliant on Jesus for everything. Being a child says we need to be reliant on others. It's a humble place. They're easily excited. I love that. They're easily excited. Boy, sometimes it takes us to get excited, See if we're going to sing a song at the end that's a clapper. Maybe. It's up to you. They're curious and they're open to new things. I love that we have to tell kids don't touch that. Right? See, my problem is I worked with teenagers for so long that I see 10 poor decisions down the road in my mind. And everything a kid does, I can see the end result that's bad. And so I'm always like, don't do that. They're like, what am I doing? Well, one time, and this is how my brain functions. We need to be curious. We need to be imaginative, joy-filled. We need to, when we cry, when we mourn over things, we should really mourn over things, like kids do. And when we get excited and laugh over things, to really get excited and laugh. There's nothing better than seeing a kid just falling over laughing. And doesn't it break your heart when you see a kid crying? Yeah. And you know, parents, exactly why your children were crying. You knew if that was when they were a baby, if that was a hungry cry, if that was a diaper cry, if that was a they were hurt cry, if that was a they have a fever and they're sick cry. There's such honesty in that morning. So he says, welcome the children. Bring them, be children, and welcome the children. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. When you welcome children, guess who you welcome? Jesus. Jesus. And if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, here it comes. Sweet, kind, loving Jesus lays it down. It would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Hurting kids is bad with God. You know the millstone's that giant stone that the mule would walk and it would turn and it would crush grain. Jesus says, if you hurt children, it would be better for you to take that, wrap that around your neck, and jump into the deepest ocean. You know the results, right? It's bad. You see, we as church people, often we as adults, we as those who have grown up, often we damage the next generation by just the very ways we do things. What are we leaving for them in the church? Someone once said that the church won't exist for our children because it doesn't exist for them now. If it doesn't exist for them now, it will not exist for them 20 years from now. This country, our planet, we can go on, we can talk about the church all day, but what are we leaving by way of our country, right? Who cares about the national debt? I'll be dead. Right? Who cares about this? Who cares about that? Our planet. The damage we do to the next generation is done because of our unwillingness to really welcome, to really love, and to have them among us. Because kids, as much as they're all those wonderful things, they're messy, aren't they? They're difficult. They're dirty. They can be annoying. They're loud. See where I'm at. I'm not having another one. They're all of those things. In Matthew 19, then the people brought the children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. Jesus is busy, right? There are more important things to do. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them." Let the little children come. Don't hinder. Get out of the way and let the kids come. Stop being a barrier. Stop being the ones that say, I don't want to do this or to do that. I want things my way, not the way the kids would appreciate them. I'd rather complain about them than try to understand them. I'd rather shuffle them off to another place than to adjust how we do things for them. I want you to dream with me for a moment as we wrap this up. What would our church look like if it were to be welcome to the next generation? What would it look like? What would it feel like? And I know now some of you are getting a little tense because here he goes. Imagine a church that you loved, that your kids loved, that teens loved, and young adults loved. You see, a lot of churches, they decide they're going to reach kids and they just ruin it for all of you. Right? I don't think it has to be that way. I think we can dream of a multi-generational church, a church that is relevant and speaks to youth and teens and children, and to their parents and to their grandparents, and even to their great-grandparents. I think we can dream of that church, a church in which we let the little children come because we are more concerned about their faith and about their lives than we are about ours. I want my kids to love church, don't you? I do, and you know what? They don't. They don't. And I imagine many of you might say the same thing, that your kids and your grandkids don't love church. They don't love being in God's house. They come and they're like, right? And we often think it's their fault. We need to learn to sit still. They do. It's good to sit still eventually. Someday. Not that much, though. Really, it's our fault. And that's up to us. And it can change. Loving our neighbor is about loving the next generation, not just in word, but in deed and in action and in the way we do things. And it begins by talking to them, asking them what they think, including them, challenging them. Every time I go to a training thing, the last thing I went to, last August, I went to the School of Congregational Development, and I went to the breakout seminar on reaching the next generation. The guy that was leading it was 72 years old. And I thought, and he had a lot of great stuff to say. But it would be inappropriate for me at age 45 to lead that. I kept thinking, wouldn't it be good to have somebody that's like 17, somebody that's like 25, somebody that's like 35, and ask them, how do we reach you? What are we doing wrong? Problem is when we ask them, they give us answers like the ones I read, and we go, so then we don't ask the question. And we get an expert to tell us what we should think, and then we don't, we need to challenge them as well. This next year, beginning in October, our church is going to take a journey together called Growing Younger. And it's part of a conference-wide journey. There's going to be 4 of us that are going to be really intense involved in this. Myself and 3 others have to go to bunch of trainings and things. But we're going to invite others of you to be part of this with us. Haven't worked that out yet. It might just be a church-wide Bible study or topical study that we do midweek. That we get together. It might be that you just get into some groups with people and do the study. You don't need me to lead it. You're all smart enough, right? And we spend a year together asking the question, how do we grow younger? Right? It's just a shift. Grow younger. If you're curious about that, I encourage you to go on Amazon and buy the book called Growing Younger. It's green. Make sure you get the green one. I don't know if there's any other books called that. Pretty sure that's the one that comes up. And start reading it. Start thinking about what that looks like. And then I want us to begin today by having just a time of prayer for the next generation. So I'm going to ask you to bow your heads. And I'm going to ask God to show us in our mind those faces of our kids, our grandkids, our great-grandkids, our nieces, our nephews, the children we see on our streets, the teenagers that are loud and obnoxious sometimes in your neighborhood. Lord Jesus, would you reveal to our mind those faces? And then would you begin even now praying that God would touch their lives and that God would touch us so that we might reach them. God, forgive us for denying and not letting the children come and for putting stumbling blocks in front of them, between you and them. Forgive us, God. We think that only other people deserve the millstone. We think that when we lock people up and we separate children, that that's millstone worthy. But oftentimes our lack of love for children is just as millstone worthy. We deny the next generation. God, forgive us. Forgive us for the atrocities we do as a country. And forgive us for those subtle ways that we ignore the next generation. God, help us to change. Help us to be open. Help us to once again find what it means to be a child. To laugh and to cry and to be full of joy and excitement and all of those things, God. Lord, journey with us this year as we think about what it means to grow younger, what it means to be a church that doesn't just reach the next generation, but a church that is all about the next generation and the generation after that, God. Fill this place with people from all different age groups, that we might learn and grow from each other. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. And our closing hymn is one, we did this a few months ago and we didn't do it well because we had a different version. This little light of mine, it's the version you know. And I want you to stand up and I want you to clap it and do how you do when you were a kid. Let's sing to God.